Hey everyone, and welcome to our session 11 of BIOP, where we're going to be looking at drugs affecting the central nervous system. There is a lot of different drugs that work within the central nervous system, so this is actually going to go over 2 sessions. Even with splitting it up, this is a pretty huge one today, so make sure you give yourself a little bit of extra time this week to be able to go through this big range of drugs that we're actually going to cover. So we'll start by doing a bit of a review of central nervous system function and introduce some of the different pathology in the central nervous system, and that will be so we can understand how exactly these drugs aim to address some of those pathologies. So we're going to cover benzodiazepines and their use in anxiety and insomnia. We'll cover a range of different antidepressant drugs. We'll look at the use of lithium as a mood stabiliser in bipolar. Some different anti-epileptic drugs and the use of antipsychotics as well. So to be able to understand how these drugs work, we need to make sure we have some understanding of the central nervous system and the neurotransmitters that are used within it. So this follows on from our discussion last session of drugs acting in the peripheral nervous system, which, as the nervous system goes, is a relatively simple system. The central nervous system is much more complex. You can see that first just in all of these different areas of the central nervous system that are mapped out here. But these different regions of the central nervous system aren't actually especially important in pharmacology because these are anatomical divisions. And while they're separate areas of our central nervous system, they are all heavily interconnected to one another by neurons. And as well as that interconnectivity, we find that you have the same neurotransmitters being used through many of these different anatomical areas of the nervous system. So they're not chemical divisions, just anatomical divisions. So the drugs tend to work across a number of different anatomical areas. So our central nervous system is, of course, the area that the peripheral nervous system brings information to via its sensory division. Afferent pathways bring in information about all sorts of internal and external conditions: muscle tension, blood vessels, alterations, pain, fever, your complex special senses like sound, smell, taste, touch, sight. The central nervous system is able to take in all of this information, integrate it, and create messages that will then be relayed back to the peripheral nervous system for all the necessary adjustments or actions, from control of our internal environment through to our movements and our interactions with our environment and others around us. So through this, our central nervous system has control of most aspects of our internal environment and all of our interactions with the external environment. Now, to have this processing of information, sending in of information, creation of outputs, all of these actions come back down to the actions of the nerve cells on a cellular level, the neurons, and what they're doing. In the nervous system, we've got the neurons themselves, and then we also have glial cells. So the glial cells are the cells that support the neurons, providing insulating myelin sheath, providing a safe environment for the neurons to exist in. They need a much more delicately controlled environment than most of the tissues of the body. And while we're learning more and more all the time about the complexity of the role that the glial cells play, in pharmacology, we're still very much focused on the neurons, and they are, in fact, the main functional cells of our nervous system. Most of the functions of the nervous system come back to the neurons, and what the glial cells are doing are just playing supporting roles. Now, our neurons are those cells capable of having electrical impulses, action potentials, and information flows from one neuron to another. The one that it's flowing from we call the presynaptic neuron, and it forms a connection with another neuron that we would then refer to as the postsynaptic neuron. So we say connection, but they're not actually physically touching. There is a small gap in between each neuron, and the flow of information from one neuron to another, or neurotransmission, actually involves chemical transport of that information, of that message that's being sent. And so where we have a chemical signalling system, we have the potential for that chemical signalling system to be changed with the actions of drugs, and that's what we're looking at here. The neuron receives that chemical signal and alters its activities in ways that relate to electrical currents. So various ion channels and other pumps and things that regulate levels of ions are going to be involved in the transmission of that message, as well as the chemical signals themselves, the neurotransmitters, their receptors, and also any other things like enzymes that regulate the amount of neurotransmitter. We'll find that at the synapse, where this chemical signalling is going on, is where the drugs are going to be having effects in almost all the cases. So in almost all cases, neurally acting drugs act at a synapse, either interacting directly with neurotransmitter receptors or in some other way altering the amount or availability of the neurotransmitter. So there is many different types of neurotransmitters. 40 is a bare minimum, as we've got here, 40 different types of neurotransmitters, and in fact 40 different types of different neurons that have different transmitter profiles. For every neuron, there's always a primary neurotransmitter, and in the majority of cases, the vast majority of cases, it's one of those neurotransmitters listed in the bold here. So the most common neurotransmitters in the central nervous system and the primary neurotransmitters are acetylcholine, serotonin, dopamine, noradrenaline. Those ones you hear about fairly often, even just through study of disease or in more popular sources. And then also GABA and glutamate, which are actually far more widespread than these lower ones. Most of the neurons in the brain are glutamatergic or GABAergic. There's a few other ones around as well, but these are our main primary neurotransmitters. Other neurotransmitters tend to be co-transmitters. They get released alongside one of these primary transmitters in certain circumstances. So you might get a glutamatergic neuron that also releases a peptide transmitter, maybe something like substance P. You might get a dopaminergic neuron that also releases a different type of peptide transmitter, say an enkephalin or something like that. So other transmitters that aren't listed here tend to be the secondary transmitters, which is why these are the ones you hear the most about. Most of the drugs act on these primary neurotransmitters, and the neurons always get named after these primary neurotransmitters. So we talked about that in the last lecture, how you would call a neuron, say, cholinergic or adrenergic, glutamatergic, GABAergic, etc. So through the actions of neurons using these neurotransmitters to communicate with each other, we are able to have the central nervous system create our mind and emotions. So these are some of the outputs of our central nervous system, just as much as movement or changing your blood pressure is an output of the central nervous system. And so all of those mind and emotion functions come back down to actions of neurons and neurotransmitters that they use to communicate with each other. So when there is problems within the mind and emotions, there are drugs that are able to treat some of the symptoms of those disorders. We also have the brain involved in regulation of various physiological functions, your blood pressure, respiration, endocrine secretions. Sometimes when there's disorders in those systems, the drugs we have some action in the central nervous system, and vice versa. Sometimes when we're aiming to treat the mind and emotions, the drugs end up affecting some physiological functions as well, because again, there's no real chemical division between the two different aspects of the central nervous system's function. It's responsible for physiological functions and for all of these mind and emotion functions: consciousness, behaviour, memory, recognition, learning, imagination, creativity, reasoning, all of those more abstract processes. And the same tools are being used by the brain regardless of what kind of activity it's involved in. So when we try and alter that with drugs, we're going to be altering physiology as well as mind, whichever one we are aiming to alter. Now, we have the same neurotransmitters usually found in a number of different parts of the brain, and through those different areas, they'll be involved in different functions. They'll be contributing to lots of different functions in different parts of the brain. And the same area of the brain can be made use of in a number of different functions as well. So we can never say exactly that a neurotransmitter plays just one particular role, but we can say that certain neurotransmitters are more associated with certain functions than they are with other functions. So I'm going to list here some areas of the brain where these certain primary neurotransmitters predominate, and some functions that they predominate in or have a predominant role in. But just remember that in the end, these neurotransmitters are just a tool that neurons use to talk to each other, and your brain can employ those tools for quite a range of different purposes. So you might think of it as if I said a car is a tool for driving to work. Yes, you can drive to work in your car, but you could also go plenty of other places in it. And there is plenty of other ways to get to work without using a car. So when you hear something like acetylcholine is involved in memory, yes, acetylcholine is involved in memory, but we also have many other things that are involved in memory. It doesn't have sole responsibility for it. And you'll see even from this brief list, acetylcholine has a number of other functions as well. So we find acetylcholine throughout the cerebral cortex, and it also has an important role in the pyramidal pathway controlling movement. We know it's essential for proper cognition, for skeletal muscle movement through its actions in the pyramidal pathway. It has essential roles in memory and in consciousness overall. We get some strong clues as to its role by looking at what happens when some cholinergic neurons are disturbed, and you'll see that there is changes in cholinergic signalling in dementia and Parkinson's disease. Dopamine is found within the hypothalamus, so that controls our autonomic nervous system and is also one of the major links between the higher order thinking and feeling areas of the brain and the deeper lizard brain areas that control our physiological functions. It's a major link between those systems. So you'll find dopamine there within the hypothalamus, also throughout what we call the limbic system that's involved in emotional regulation, and what's called the extrapyramidal pathway, or sometimes the indirect pathway of movement control. So through these areas of the brain, it participates in the regulation of skeletal muscle movement, of behaviour, directing behaviour, habit forming in particular. It's involved within the brainstem in regulating emesis or vomiting, and in the hypothalamus in regulating hormone release. We know there is disturbance of dopaminergic neurons in Parkinson's disease in various aberrant behaviour types, and you see excessive levels of dopamine in disorders like schizophrenia. Glutamate is one of the most common neurotransmitters around the brain. It's the most common excitatory neurotransmitter, and you find it abundantly through all regions of the brain, but most especially so in the cortex and the basal ganglia, those deeper areas of grey matter within the cerebrum. So many different aspects of cognition they're going to be involved in then. And we often have particular interest in the role of glutamate in learning and memory. In terms of conditions related to disturbed glutamate functioning, we see in epilepsy and some neurodegenerative diseases, and also very important in excitotoxicity, which is something that can cause extensive damage to any area of the brain that has become ischemic due to injury or stroke or something like that, where you get overactivity of glutamate that ends up then causing more damage. Noradrenaline, we find again within the hypothalamus, that link between our autonomic system and the higher areas of the brain. It controls our autonomic nervous system and influences many of our behaviours, particularly as they relate to things like, feeding and thirst and that sort of thing. Also essential throughout the reticular activating system, a series of nuclei through the brainstem that are responsible for arousal and for regulating attention to different sensory inputs. So noradrenaline has important roles in arousal, sleep, mood, appetite, hormone release, body temperature, much of that coming through what's happening with the hypothalamic neurons. We know that there's disturbances of noradrenaline in eating disorders, in depression and in insomnia. Serotonin plays a very similar role. You'll find it through the same areas of the brain. And it's involved in the same functions as well as further things of directing behaviour. It can be involved in pain transmission as well. And we find it being disturbed in the same sorts of conditions as noradrenaline. GABA is our main inhibitory neurotransmitter throughout the brain. It's just widespread through all regions. Some of the functions that it has that we're most interested in often is its role in motor control, memory and consciousness. And it certainly plays a role in conditions that are related to usually insufficiency of GABA, aberrant behaviours, insomnia and anxiety. So when we talk about conditions being related to neurotransmitters, or you often hear the term neurotransmitter or chemical imbalances, realise that is a gross oversimplification to the point that it's not really even quite correct. Those sorts of neurological or psychiatric diseases are usually very complex in their etiology. It's not simply a case of too little of a chemical or not enough of a chemical. There is many different changes going on within the brain and many different causes that can be possible for those changes. But you still can make a useful description of those disorders by looking at neurotransmitter levels. Just realise it's not quite that simple, but if you were to have a deficiency of noradrenaline and serotonin, you would see symptoms of depression. You can induce that with drugs. You can just simply give drugs that will lower noradrenaline and serotonin, and someone will then experience symptoms of depression. That's not to say that everyone who's depressed simply has too little serotonin. It's more complicated than that. But while it's a simplification, it's still useful to approximate the disorder by saying things like deficiency in serotonin and noradrenaline with an increase in acetylcholine is related to symptoms of depression. Deficiency of acetylcholine and increase in dopamine is related to symptoms of schizophrenia. Deficiency of dopamine and increase in acetylcholine, the opposite, is something that's evident in Parkinson's disease. For a deficiency of acetylcholine and increases in noradrenaline, dopamine and glutamate is present in mania. Excuse me, and deficiency of acetylcholine and increases in the monoamines, that's your noradrenaline, adrenaline, and dopamine, will lead to symptoms of dementia. So again, oversimplification, but a reasonable approximation of some of the things that are going on in the brain with these disorders. And you'll see here it's pointed out some of the treatments aim to address these balances in order to improve disease symptoms and help to manage these disorders. So the first disorder we'll look at the treatment of will be anxiety. So for anxiety, there are a number of different disorders that have anxiety as the predominant symptom: phobias, panic disorders, obsessive compulsive and post-traumatic stress disorder among them. And as well, it's a component of many more psychiatric disorders as well. Now, there is, of course, normal anxiety, just as a typical human emotion, but considering anxiety as a disorder or part of a disorder is when those symptoms become extensive and very distressing to the individual suffering them, and particularly when they inhibit their normal life function. That's where it's going to be crossing the border into being considered disordered and possibly in need of pharmacological treatment. So anxiety is really defined by subjective signs and symptoms, things like worry, apprehension, fear, nervousness and indecision, all of which that are outsized for the circumstances that are triggering them. With this can come impaired concentration and depersonalisation, where you get very significant feelings of disconnection from others and the world around you. And irritability can also be incident in some individuals as well as a sign of their anxiety. Now, in terms of what's actually going on within the brain in anxiety, again, it's a complex situation, but some of the neurochemistry involves increased activity of certain noradrenergic and serotonergic neurons. The increased activity of noradrenergic neurons are what's behind that signs and symptoms of a heightened sympathetic response, so the fight or flight type feelings, and the serotonergic neurons, particularly those connecting to the amygdala, cause people to have increased responsiveness to aversive stimuli, more fear and apprehension. These neurons are in turn controlled by GABAergic neurons. So increasing activity of those GABAergic neurons, with GABA being an inhibitory neurotransmitter, it can decrease the activity of those neurons. So based on this, theoretically, drugs that either reduce the activity of noradrenaline and serotonin or increase the activity of GABA within the brain are good anxiolytics, that is anti-anxiety drugs. Now, in practice, we really just use those that increase the activity of GABA in short-term acute relief of anxiety. And in fact, we use drugs that end up increasing noradrenaline and serotonin slightly to help treat anxiety in the longer term. That would be antidepressants that we'll look at more for their treatment of depression, which sounds a little bit paradoxical at first, but you can sometimes get those situations arising when you're looking at neurochemistry. Just coming back to the fact that the brain is so complex and these neurotransmitters are in so many different sections of the brain, and that it's not just a simple case of up-down of different neurotransmitters, even though we sometimes like to simplify it to that level. Now, with anxiety often comes insomnia. It's very often related to anxiety and anxiety disorders or other psychiatric disorders as well. And we'll incorporate that here because we'll find that some of the same drugs are used in its treatment as those for treating anxiety. So insomnia is an inability to fall asleep, difficulty in maintaining sleep, could be early awakenings, or just a feeling of not being rested despite sufficient opportunity for sleep. Now, all of these aren't necessarily insomnia, but these are all things that can be typical in insomnia. The amount of sleep a person requires is subjective and highly variable between 3 and 10 hours, though the vast majority of the population requires 7 to 8 hours sleep. Most people who claim they need less sleep, they might be getting along fine, but they would be doing better if they were getting their 7 to 8 hours of sleep at night. In the incidence of insomnia, it does tend to be a bit more common in women and can often vary along the menstrual cycle in women, being incident at certain points in the cycle, or can become incident with pregnancy or menopause as well, which probably accounts for much of the higher numbers of insomniacs among women. And it can be occasional or a very chronic problem for different people as well. Now, insomnia is going to generally be multifactorial. It's not usually going to have one particular cause, but there's the types of things that can contribute to it. Can be environmental, noise, light, uncomfortable situations. It can be biological, to do with old age, pregnancy, menstrual cycle, jet lag, poor sleep hygiene, so not making appropriate time for sleep, not getting sufficient activity to become tired enough for sleep, those sorts of things. There can be social factors, there can be drugs, even things like caffeine and nicotine are going to have stimulant effects. Alcohol, well, if you have enough of it, it will make you unconscious. It doesn't tend to give good quality of sleep, and small amounts of alcohol usually actually keep people awake. There's also a lot of medical conditions that can keep people awake: pain, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease and breathing difficulties from it, and so on. And it's a common part of many psychiatric disorders. Now, there are many aspects of this that can be addressed behaviourally. For medical conditions and other psychiatric disorders, addressing those disorders primarily will usually help the insomnia as well. But there can be occasions where insomnia itself needs a pharmacological treatment. And when that's the case, we usually go to the benzodiazepines. We are getting a bit long in this screencast though, so I'll go on to the next screencast to explain about the benzodiazepines.